And if you're thinking, cool, who cares? Well, you're not alone. Because Treasury yields sound like the kind of thing that only matters to men in Patagonia vest, who drink $8 iced lattes and talk about risk-adjusted returns at dinner parties. But the reality is, hidden inside that number is the price of money, because that single number helps determine the borrowing cost on trillions of dollars of debt. And for the first time since 2007, it's flashing a signal we haven't seen in nearly 2 decades. But the real story isn't just the headline number you see on social media, it's the damage that number is quietly causing underneath the surface. And that damage is starting to surface in a $2 trillion asset class where the cracks are becoming harder to ignore. But here's the part that's strange. Even as interest rates are rising at the fastest pace in recent history, and signs of credit stress are materializing in the data, many of the players in the industry are still selling the idea that everything is under control, that this is all overblown, and the market remains as healthy as ever. But the reality is, those two things can't coexist. And that's what makes this so interesting, because this story has only just begun, and it's quietly unfolding right in front of our eyes in real time. And there's a reason you haven't heard about this. It's not by accident. The hush-hush surrounding all this is by design. But to understand what's happening, we need to back up. And we have to start with that one number from earlier. Because when the 30-year Treasury spiked to over 5%, the United States had at least one thing going for it. At least there was company. Because the UK's 30-year just climbed to its highest level since 1998, while Germany's 30-year reached its highest level since 2011. And not only did Japan's 10-year rise to levels it hadn't seen since 1999, but Japan's 30-year is now sitting at an all-time high. So when 4 of the largest sovereign bond markets in the world start doing their best impression of Dogecoin after an Elon Musk tweet, it raises one very important question. What the fuck is happening? Because the bond market's supposed to be boring, it's supposed to be predictable, uneventful, and something your grandpa falls asleep watching. And that's why it often gets labeled as the adult in the room. But right now, while everyone's distracted watching stocks go vertical and the AI hype, the adult in the room quietly just pulled the plug on the party. And before we get into what higher yields actually mean for the economy and why investors are quietly freaking out, it's worth taking 30 seconds to explain what makes a bond yield move in the first place. Because the movement in the yields is the real story. What matters is the underlying mechanics of why they moved. The number you see in the headlines is just the symptom. And in its simplest form, a bond is just an IOU. It can be the government, a company, or anyone who wants to borrow money. They issue a piece of paper that promises to pay back a fixed amount at a fixed maturity date. People bid for that paper, and the price those buyers are willing to pay determines the yield. So the relationship between a bond's price and its yield are inversely related. If buyers are scrambling to buy the bond, the price gets bid up, and the yield falls. If buyers aren't interested, the price has to drop to attract new buyers, and the yield rises. Price down, yield up. Price up, yield down. That's the relationship between a bond's price and its yield. So when yields are rising across the board, it means buyers are demanding a higher return before they'll lock their money up. And that happens for 4 main reasons. First, the Federal Reserve. The Fed sets the baseline interest rate for the entire economy. So if the Fed raises the baseline rate to 5%, nobody wants an old bond paying just 3%. So to get rid of that old bond, sellers have to slash its price until its yield matches the new rate environment. Second, inflation. If you think your dollars are going to be worth less when the bond matures, you want more return up front to compensate. Third, supply. The U.S. has been issuing Costco-sized amounts of new debt every year. At some point, the auction room starts running out of hands willing to go up. So more supply means fewer eager buyers, which leads to prices falling and yields rising. And fourth, demand. Foreign central banks, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, the institutions that used to reliably show up at Treasury auctions. If they start to doubt that the U.S. can pay back its nearly $40 trillion of debt, well, they start to pull back. And if that happens, the price has to drop until someone is finally willing to walk in. And what makes bond yields a favorite for economists is each maturity tells a different part of the story. Each maturity sends a different signal about the economy. The 2-year mostly reflects what the market thinks the Fed will do in the near term. The 10-year is the favorite. It's the global benchmark. Almost every other rate across asset classes gets anchored to it. And the 30-year? Well, it's the rate that asks the question, do you actually trust the United States fiscal situation long term? It prices 3 decades of inflation, 3 decades of deficits, and 3 decades of United States fiscal decisions. But while the long end of the yield curve is sitting at levels we haven't seen in nearly 2 decades, that's actually not even the scariest part, because if there's one thing the Federal Reserve has mastered, it's taking today's problems and handing them to tomorrow. But there's some problems that can't be passed off. Because what's causing the real pain right now is on the other end of the yield curve, the short end. And it's the short end that the Fed has their little greasy fingerprints all over. But before we get into that, a quick pause, because here's a number that stuck with me. Back in 2008, researchers at UC San Diego found the average American takes in roughly 100,000 words and 34 gigabytes of information every single day. And that was before the first iPad existed. Imagine what that number looks like now. So if you're like me, your Notes app is a graveyard of half-finished thoughts, and your voice memos are ramblings you never replay. Which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, Plod. With the Plod Note Pro, you can transcribe your conversations, calls, and notes into clear summaries and searchable insights. And it's not just for audio either. With Plod's unique multimodal input, you can add text and images too, so the full context lives in one place. So for a video like this one, I can simply ask Plod, what was the relationship between a bond's price and its yield? There's no more digging through notes, no more hunting for information. It's the answers you need when you need them. Plod is the solution for a world where you're taking in more than 100,000 words and 34 gigabytes of information every single day, and with a 4.9 star rating and more than 2 million users globally, Plod's track record speaks for itself. So if you're tired of losing track of the ideas, conversations, and details you swore you'd remember, you can try out Plod using the link below and get a free 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you to Plod for sponsoring this video. And now back to the rate that's causing all the panic right now. And that rate is called the Secured Overnight Financing Rate, or SOFR. You can think of it as the overnight receipt for the entire U.S. financial system. It's a single number, published every morning, that tells the market what overnight borrowing actually cost the day before, based on real transactions. It's not a guess or a target rate. It's based on actual trades that have been cleared and settled. And in early 2022, SOFR was effectively zero. Then the Fed started hiking, and by mid-2023, SOFR was over 5%. And now, even after a year and a half of rate cuts, it's still sitting higher than where we were before the pandemic. And when rates rise this aggressively, there's consequences. Because when most people think about debt, they think fixed rate, like a mortgage. You lock in an interest rate on day one, the rate environment can do whatever it wants afterward, and your payment doesn't change. But there's an entire other category of debt called floating rate, which works the opposite way. A floating rate loan doesn't pick a fixed rate at origination. It picks a benchmark, which is almost always SOFR, and then it adds a spread on top. That spread is the lender's premium for taking on the risk. With floating rate loans, the interest rate on the loan is directly tied to the benchmark it's pegged to. So if SOFR moves, the interest rate on the loan moves too. Meaning if SOFR rises, the borrower's interest on the debt rises. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. This is where the consequences of rapidly rising rates begin to show up. And to see where the impact lands, we need to follow the money a little further downstream, to private credit. Private credit is essentially just private lending. They hit the weird middle market of the credit world.